So I'll give you guys just a little sense of where I'm at today. We had a party last night. We closed on our last deal. We've had a running deal. We're going to talk about this. We've had open construction notes for 4 years. And so in the banking industry, maybe you can appreciate what it's like to close on a construction note and not have that note going on. And so us and our bank and our anchor tenant, Allo Telecommunications, we decided to have a party last night. And our brewery sold so much beer that they ran out of cups. And so that's where I'm standing at today. And so I have a lot of implied stuff in here. But what I want to do is just be very expressly clear on 3 points, because you'll remember about 10% of what I say. Mike had the first point being Mike said had a comment, and the quote was the property was acquired by someone that cared about their community, Ray O'Connor in Grand Island. I've got a different terminology for that, and I think that all projects, all development takes someone that gives a shit about their community. And ultimately that's what it comes down to. And really, as we go through here, like that's implied, we have people that you're expecting to take a double bottom line return that are looking at that lower rate of return in a rural area, but they're doing it because it's good for their community, it's good for the bigger picture of what their business is. And so as a community, we expect our developers, our investors to take on maybe a little bit more risk in rural areas than they would have to otherwise because of that double bottom line return. And so ultimately that takes somebody that cares and isn't just seeking direct profit as their primary motive for development. And so understanding how we find those people, how we cultivate those people, I'll walk you through a little bit of that today and the role that the banker plays in that process. And so that just really wanted to expressly state that. The second one is that if you expect that behavior in your community, you have to understand as a bank how you reciprocate it. You absolutely have to understand how you are more than just a bank and how you can help enable those folks by maybe doing more than what you traditionally might or what your comfort zone is as a bank. And so we'll walk through a little bit of that too. And finally, just after the presentations this morning, one thing that constantly comes to my mind is the purpose of government funds. And I've got some pretty strongly held opinions on the purpose of government funds when it comes to incentives. And I do think that we need to think very intentionally about our government funds, understanding that they are first and foremost a direct and intentional investment from the public, meant to achieve, change, or direct a certain behavior that's not occurring naturally in the market. And so as we're using TIF or as we're using affordable housing trust funds as a public, we've identified a behavior that we ultimately want to see that's not happening in the market. And so we're investing funds in order to achieve that behavior. And ultimately to an end that we hope would prove concept and let the market correct or prove itself. And so ultimately I believe that the government funds could and should act as a proof of concept, as a change modifier, and not necessarily a subsidy, because we just simply in our climate today can't afford that. So the easy math on a project, and this is where we started. I assembled a group of friends, local investors, because I'm a firm believer in the aggregation of capital in order to mitigate risk. And so simply put, if we all throw in a little bit, kind of like the folks in Gothenburg, none of us will lose our ass. And that was the deal here where we picked up a dilapidated building that had been valued historically, was increasing at about maybe 1% to 2% in increase. I think over 10 years it increased from $59,000 to $62,000 in taxable valuation. We spent about $600,000 on that building that had appraised out, like Mike said, at about $500,000, and ultimately achieved a taxable valuation of $355,494. That's our certified valuation heading into next year. And so you can understand from some of those numbers where gaps might occur. When you go in and you want to do a project and your appraisal comes in at $500,000 and ultimately the project costs 20% more than that, there's a funding gap, there's a lending gap that can occur. You can say just make it up with cash, like that's the easy thing to say, but when you're already projecting a low cash on cash return and you already have an undesirable cap rate when you look at the project, it's kind of hard to go to your friends and just say, hey, let's just make it up with cash. And so that's an opportunity to help build the capital stack that Mike talked about earlier. These numbers here, when you see a 5x increase on taxable valuation, that's kind of the sell to the city, right? Like, hey, we're going to take this dilapidated property and we're going to increase your tax receipts 5x. That's the easy math. in my opinion, that you can show, and that's the easy case for TIF. Ultimately, though, is there something that isn't necessarily simple and quantifiable, especially when you go into our communities. And so ultimately, there's a cultural change that occurs, there's an energy change that occurs, and there's a whole lot of rollover impact when you take something that looks like the picture on the left there and you turn it into something that looks like the picture on the right. And so that happens in a community. What you also do, though, is you prove concept not only to the developers there, and so we were able, I'm giving myself a headache, we were able to go into this building and redo this at a relatively low cost of entry for us and a low level of risk. Our partnership is an OBGYN in town who has a vested interest in a healthy and vibrant community because that's where his practice is. And two gentlemen that each own manufacturing companies that have a vested interest in the success of the town because of their workforce, and then myself. But what we saw when we did the first building, we saw 100% occupancy instantly, and we saw healthy tenants on the main floor instantly, and we saw a rate of return or an income that was servicing our debt and was coming in at where we thought it would be. And so then we had the chance to buy the building next door because the alternative was a guy that develops gentlemen's clubs around the state was going to buy it. And so we figured that maybe wasn't the best thing in the world. And so we bought the building next door and we started redeveloping it. And as we were redeveloping it, the building on the left that you can see sheeted up there, we started redeveloping then the building on the far end of the block. So we went from spending $600,000 in our first building to just over $1 million in the second building there, and we just closed our note at just shy of $1.5 million on just the debt we incurred. It was about a 1.9 total project on the building on the right. And all that was because we had a small investment in the first building, a funding stack that worked, and it proved concept to our local investment team that we could do this. And so, we saw a behavior change that ultimately led to turning vacancy, what I would say vacancy into vibrancy, turning unusable and space that had been vacant for decades into new homes, and ultimately places where people live and spend money. Taking vacant areas that were vacant roofs and turning them into roof decks. I mean, these things, if you're an 18 to 34-year-old, this is pretty attractive. Most of our tenants are 18 to 34-year-olds, giving people places where they want to live instead of living in a basement 3 towns over, is what we've worked to do at our place. This one didn't pull all the way through, but so last night we celebrated and we had our friends Nick and Tyler in, and we had a party and a whole bunch of people came. I put this slide together at midnight and sent it in, but we had a great time, and everyone showed up and they were positive about the community, and they talked about other buildings that we could be doing in town and other projects that we could be undertaking and what could be in our community versus if you go back to the very first slide we looked at and that building on the left, what wasn't and what couldn't be. And so ultimately we used this public incentive as a behavior modifier to take what couldn't be on some really undesirable land in our community that was vacant. I used to go by this when I drove home when my wife and I redeveloped a building downtown to live in, and all of these stalls, you can see them, they were always vacant. Now I go in there and we have 19 apartment units and 4 businesses downstairs that will employ 75 people, and every single lot is full, every single stall is full, the parking lot across the street is full, and the parking that we've developed in back of the building is full. And so, yeah, we had a really fun party, and we drank a lot of beer, and we celebrated a lot of local success, and hopefully built up the confidence to do this again. A quote that Mark had asked when we were putting this together, he said, really, we just want to know how to avoid risk, get paid back, and look like heroes. And I thought, well, that does sound like a banker. And so I thought, in my little mind, what are the steps to do that? And so really look at identifying community needs, generating community support. That means establishing community infrastructure, and that's exactly what Mike walked you through. That's those are your housing studies, those are those needs analysis, that's putting together the infrastructure for your CRA. We absolutely could not have achieved any of this but for our Community Redevelopment Authority and Randy Chick, who runs that. And then helping investors in your community and community champions to understand their roles. And so when I first went and talked to our partners, they laughed at me and said, "We don't have any business owning old shitty buildings in downtown Hastings, Dave." And but then you have to help those folks in their community, and some of those are your peers at the bank, to understand what your role is, and ultimately to help aggregate that double bottom line capital. And then your role is to be more than just a bank. When my wife and I decided that we wanted to redo an old building in downtown Hastings before any of this started, I was pretty arrogant about the fact that we would get the money to do it. I had 5 or 6 banks on my board at the time when I was running the local development corporation. I'm not a complete idiot, and we had 20 to 30% in the bank to put down as a deposit. Every single bank I talked to said, "Dave, we don't have a product for that. There's no comparables. We can't give you a residential mortgage to do this." And some guys that did a project 5 years ago lost their behinds on it, and so we don't want to touch it. Every bank that I talked to, they said that they would be gracious enough to give me a 5-year balloon note for us to go in and redo that. And so eventually I called a bank and I said, "Hey, we're going to do this project." I didn't tell him that everyone else had said no, and he knew that he'd originally said no. I said, "We're going to do this. Do you want to be on board or not? I don't think you should miss out on this." And he figured out a way to get there, and they did a 30-year note for us. We ultimately sold that in 2 years, and we tripled our money. And then there was a comparable downtown. But if he would have said no, if he would have been just a bank and not had the product, like the rest of them didn't have the product, Christy and I would have never known that we could have done that. We would have never tripled our money, and we would have never taken on, ultimately, everything that we just looked at the slides on. And everyone else said no. And so there's the opportunity for you to be more than just a bank by being part of your community and part of the risk there, and understanding how you can get to yes and enable those people that give a shit about their community. Our case study, though, very simple and quantified. 5x increase in taxable valuation, $4.5 million in total investment. We've used $220,000 in TIF. Even though we've had that level of investment, you kind of saw earlier where our assessment comes in, and so your investment doesn't matter as much. We are firm believers in optimizers of TIF. After interest expense, property taxes is our second highest number on our pro forma, and so we just need to be careful there. We've completely redeveloped 33,000 square feet of formerly vacant property, 4 new businesses, 75 new jobs, 19 new apartment units, and because of how we've stacked our funds and the community participation with facade grants and TIF, our investors are realizing somewhere around a 17% return on their cash. But the realities are, like we've talked about, that your total project cost will exceed your appraised value, highly likely. There will be a lack of comparable developments, which do create impediments. Redevelopment is certainly not a cheaper means by which, this is a kind of a thing that's out there, that it could be a cheap way to add housing. It's not. Your traditional development metrics don't necessarily apply in our rural communities. They're hard to understand because of the level of rents aren't what they are in Lincoln and Omaha, but the construction costs are as much or more in rural communities. And so if you look at our cap rate right now at 100% occupancy and everything that we have, we still have a sub 7% cap rate. And that's not sexy for people from the eastern side of our state to come out and do projects that they don't have to do in rural Nebraska. And then ultimately, if a direct and immediate profit motive is your primary objective, you're probably in the wrong line of work. And then just really congruent with what Mike said, success requires many mothers and fathers. There's a whole lot of people that need to come together in order to make this work. We were lucky a lot of them came and hung out and drank beer with us last night. That's who I am. I am super passionate about this. I firmly believe that the only way that we can ultimately achieve what we all want to see is by people who care in our communities and surrounding them with the resources that we need to enable them, not discourage them. And if you have any questions, I'm super transparent on what we do, because I firmly believe the only way to replicate behavior and scale it is for people to understand it. And so always happy to answer any questions either here or offline. Thanks.